Hello, welcome to my identity development project. My name is Ron Alexander, and I'm looking forward to kind of sharing my experiences and sharing kind of what my identities that I kind of uphold currently and how they have kind of evolutionized my experience as a practitioner here in student affairs. So, welcome, and I'm looking forward to hosting you all. So the presentation today is we're gonna cover a couple things. So I'm gonna go over kind of what my how I feel my identity is overall, being a black male in a black body, and kind of like what that looks like in terms of real time and how that has really changed my experiences thus far. Also being a black male in higher ed and how that kind of relates to my personal life and how I show up in that identity. We'll talk a little bit about my sexual identity, being bi or gay. Age is a huge thing that I would actually and can't wait to talk about, and even also socioeconomic status and how me being a first generation kind of like full-time worker in my family has influenced how I look at my socioeconomic status. And then finally, we'll wrap up with intersections and how I show up in some of those intersections that I identify as some of my most salient identities. So, looking forward to the discussion and hope that you enjoy. Thanks. So as I start this kind of like journey into my identity, I think the first thing, again, is to really own who my name, because I think that's the first thing that we kind of are assigned to ourselves as our identity is our name. And so, my full name is Ronald Aaron Alexander III. Typically, I go by Ronald Alexander, but now recently, in the past maybe 4 or 5 years, I go by Ron. And I kind of will give you that insight of like kind of why my name has kind of transitioned in the past and deals with a lot about my family, my background, or my relations with my parents, and so I will give you that. So again, I'm Ron. That's what I go by now, and so the first thing and foremost about Ron is that Ron is a proud black male. Um, Being black and being raised in the South is something that not all are proud of, right? And so I've learned to really just grow into my identity as a black man. And it's been hard. I will say that's probably been the most challenging part of being in my identity is being a black male, because I've been from knowing that I was different to knowing that black men have these stereotypes about themselves, and so trying to always not even hide it, but trying to defy some of those stereotypes in my life has been like kind of my life's work. And so going back to when I was a kid, I was told by my parents, and I'll give you background about my parents. My mom was born in Atlanta, Georgia. My dad was born in New York, so East Coast baby all the way, yay. And so for me, my dad moved to Atlanta for college. He went to Clark Atlanta University, which is an HBCU in downtown Atlanta. And then my mom went to Spelman College, which is next door to Clark in Atlanta as well. So they both went to HBCUs. So they really instilled in me what it means to be black and be proud to be black. And they're both part of Black Greek organizations as well. And so I learned very early on about how college would be for me, and that I had no option but to go to college. And so that was what I knew. Unfortunately, my mom and dad did drop out of school early. My mom got pregnant with me when she was a sophomore in college. My dad was a junior, and they did not finish their degrees. So I am a first generation college graduate in my family, so which is pretty cool. But fun fact is that my mom went back to school when I went to undergrad, and finished the same year that I did. So that's pretty cool. And so for me, that really stuck out to me in my childhood, is that I knew that I was black and I was different. And so in elementary school, I was pretty determined to be gifted, and so I did very well with my grades. Again, education was instilled in me to be some of the best, and so education was very important to me. My father, and I will share this. Me and my father were actually very close, so hence the picture that I decided to choose in my PowerPoint is that we were the closest to each other. My mother struggled with addiction to alcohol and drugs as a young kid, and so I was always around my dad, and so he kind of instilled in me what it meant to be a man, and how I understood gender in a lot of my roles, and so that for me was a big development in my identity from my father. My father was, again, he took me to school, he raised me. I was in New York a lot, between New York and Atlanta, with my grandmother and my aunties, when I was not with him, and so those people kind of really helped found had the foundation of who I was as Ron, and so that's where I really attribute that to. So Ron is a very proud and very well equipped into education in terms of like my identity with education from those three people. As we move forward into my education, I decided to go to HBCU as well. So I went to Howard University, where I was again reaffirmed in my identity as a black man. It's also during this time when moving to DC was a time where I wanted to explore some of my just other social circles, and so this is the first time I've actually felt racism. It was definitely a time where I went to go visit Georgetown with some friends during a party, and there was a party that was happening in one of the fraternity, or not fraternity, but one of the secret societies there. And so there was the N word that was used by a lot of the white students when there was a song on, and we were just all kind of like, whoa, like they didn't have any type of forgiving or apologetic looks about them. So I think for the first time I kind of faced that I was different, especially as an 18-year-old college student, like at HBCU. I got upset. I was upset, and I just didn't understand why this was occurring. It's 2007. Like, I thought that things were changing, and especially with Barack Obama running for president, I thought it was just a different time in life. And so that really reaffirmed my identity, where I was like, I need to push back sometimes. And so college was a big part of like just finding who Ron was. And so as a black man, I discovered just how much I loved being black through going to Howard. And so ended up going to Howard, transferred to Georgia State, and then went to get my degrees at the University of West Georgia and now the University of Georgia. And so education has really defined who I am as a black man, and will continue to as I continue to do research and kind of like just hone into like what my passion areas are in this field. And so that's kind of how I show up, and I'll talk more about my higher education show up as a black man next. So I'm transitioning more now into how I show up as a black male in higher ed. And so I've been lucky and blessed to have been in this field for the past almost 7 years full time. And so, my grad program, if you add that in, it'd be almost 8, 9 years. And so being black and being a black male in higher ed has had been some of my biggest challenges, but also some of the biggest rewards. And so, for me at first, it was all about seeing myself as a advocate for other black students and black, especially like black male students on campus. And so I purposely have worked at PWIs, where they have been private, public institutions, but typically I've worked with predominantly white institutions. And so it's been a very challenging, but again, rewarding experience for me, because I don't see a lot of administrators on certain levels that look like me. And so I've been able to share the stories and shape the stories of like who black men are, be a voice, but also have a seat at the table that typically isn't taken up by people like me. And so with that has come challenges as well, because I think some of the understandings and some of the notions that come with being kind of like the only, it can result in imposter syndrome. And so I will say in the beginning part of my career is that I did experience some of that when I felt like I couldn't be authentic or be who I was, because I felt I would be judged or I would be looked at differently. So trying to really fit the mold of like what the department wanted and what the kind of like what people expected of me. And so I had to push back and say, like it's okay to be Ron. Because if I am going to show up and I'm going to go to a role or a job that appreciates me, I want to give them my full self. And so that's been a hard adjustment in this field. And so I think I show up now in my current role just being Ron. Like Ron loves rap music. Ron loves R&B music. Ron loves sports. I love to go out with my friends on the weekends. And so I have this kind of like baseline of like separation of work and friends. And so that was not always the case, because I think I was expected, especially as someone who lived on professionally, is to like always be friends with everyone. And so in my identity, there was times where people would misconstrue those things. I'm like, maybe we should set some boundaries there. And so I think over time it's been a way of like me separating myself from the job, but also when I am at the job, still showing who I am, but knowing that you don't reveal your complete self. And so those people that get that opportunity really get to see who I am as a black male personally, but I think that can also turn into like a weird type of dynamic. So for me at this point in my career, I just try to be authentic, share my story, and just show that, we as black men can be at the tables that are not always meant for us or that were not created for us, but we can shape that identity or shape that experience and make it more well versed as a different perspective. And so my passion areas again lie with like mentoring Black young men and making sure that they get their story told or get involved on campus so they can have a voice at the table. So that's kind of like how I show up and how these things kind of intersect or whatnot with my identity. So all this really related to me in our readings from chapter 5. We talked about racial identity development. And so Cross and Fang and Smith model of Black identity development really hit home for me in this honest to like my development as a Black man as in my Black identity. And so in 2001, and it says in the chapter, I think they redeveloped kind of their thinking in terms of like how they composed the theory into 3 segments of personal identity, racial salience, and I think another one was a racial group. And so from these particular perspectives and whatnot, I feel like in my identity, the socialization of myself from my childhood up now to my adulthood has really shaped my Black identity. This model really hit home with the 5 or 6 sectors that talked about adolescence, pre-adolescence, adulthood, and then negrescence. And so the idea of like how to become Black for me was really like from I started when I was a child, as for my family going to HBCUs, to me growing up and going to predominantly white high schools and middle schools, and even in college where I found my social groups, from my fraternity into my involvement with the Black Student Union, and really reaffirming like that we belong in this space here really has really countered my negrescence as a Black male in this particular field. So this theory in itself really set home for me in terms of my identity and how I continue to grow in my adulthood sector as a Black male. So another salient identity of mine is that it's my sexuality. And so this has been kind of one of my most recent identities that I've kind of accepted and really is still trying to tap into a little bit more. And so going back to childhood, like learning about gender and learning about the sexuality as a kid, I just remember always feeling like I was different. Especially during my teenage years when I turned 13 and 14, I just always knew that I was different. And so this resulted in, just to be a little more vulnerable, my first experience sexually was with actually a cousin family member because I was molested when I was a kid. And so there was a male figure in my life who was pretty close to me at the time and whatnot. And so, that for me was very hard. I dealt with that a lot, and that kind of like just changed what I thought sexually, I think, as a kid. And so I always had mannerisms that were different. I didn't want to play sports. I didn't want to be that masculine guy that we see like in high school as a jock or whatnot. I wasn't that person at all. I definitely used my hands a lot, had different gestures that I used, and I was into dolls, and I was just different. And I remember my dad asking me when I was a kid, like, "Are you gay?" And I'm like, "No." Like, so I, like a lot of people, tried to pray it away, saying that maybe it was a phase. And so it turned out it wasn't. And so I lived with that kind of like demon in myself, or hoping that it would not be true for a lot of my teenage and my early adulthood years. And so not until I actually was in student affairs, probably my second role when I moved to Washington, D.C., where I was able to feel more comfortable. It was really interesting dynamic that I had to move away from Georgia or the South to kind of feel this like empowerment of like, be who I am. Because I hid it in college. I think a lot of students get to experience things like in the closet in college, but I was not someone who was empowered to come out gay or bisexual at all, like during that time of my life. So me moving to DC was probably one of my biggest identifiers that I can think of. Am I gay or bi identity? And I say gay or bi because there's times where I think I'm gay, sometimes I think I'm bi. Still trying to figure that part out. I think that's okay because I still have an attraction to women. And so I think that in itself is just kind of like me trying to figure that part out. But until I got to DC, I didn't come out. I had 2 friends who were actually together as boyfriend and boyfriend. They got engaged while I was in DC as well. And just to see that love and this being who they were unapologetically just really said to myself, like, you can be happy, Ron. You can be happy in your identity. You can be happy as a gay man or a bi man and like still live your life. And so literally the same day they got engaged, I decided to go on Facebook and say, I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ community. And when I say I received so many like likes on social media, first of all, but also just so many words of encouragement from like friends and family that I thought I wasn't going to receive. It was a moment, and I think that to me was like, a lot of people don't have that experience to like have supportive like mom and father. Like my mom and dad called me, said they love me, which I was like, whoa, that's interesting, right? And so it's something that I definitely dealt with, like trying to internalize. But me being out and me being proud has definitely been something that I cherish since 2016. So that's a big part of my identity as well. So with that story being shared, I read an article by Hunter Rosario from 2014 from the Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology Journal that talked about LGBTQ folks of color and kind of how they kind of do their stages of coming out. And so I really kind of relate to this because they said two entry points happen. So the first is self-acceptance, which is like acknowledging non-heterosexual identity, coming out to oneself. So being okay with yourself. That's something that I had to kind of be okay before I even said, okay, let's tell others. And then there's another one about exploring multiple identities. So the congruence and conflicts among different facets of my identity. So being black from the South and being gay is really hard. My mom was and my grandmother were big in our church growing up and whatnot. And so I know a lot of folks in my kind of community were really against homosexuality, and it was kind of preached against from my pastor. So religion wasn't really something that I was really wanting to like give up, but I really realized that I need to be really who I am. And so it kept going on in terms of talking about disclosing to others, which were like kind of my close friends. That stage was really important to me because like my close friends really mean the most to me because they were like kind of like family. And so that disclosure led to support, which kind of got me empowered, which is like the next stage of the coming out process, and then individual factors and then environmental influences. And so I think that really hit home for me when I talked about moving to DC and being away from like what I knew as normal, and being able to kind of find my own rhythm. And so that really hit home and made me kind of reflect about another part that I read in our Sexual and Gender Identity Development by Patton. And so in that article, it stated, I think they had some scholars that were by Hamilton, Harris, and Harper and Quay back in 2010 and 2014. And they said in this particular statement, they said they singled out the fraternity and sorority system as a social context in which gender is particularly salient. Involvement in fraternities and sororities has been shown to increase the strength of previously held ideas about gender and sex roles. And so my fraternity experience, I'm a part of a predominantly black fraternity in the Divine Nine. And so that experience with like being, hyper masculine and very like just hookup culture related was really big and part of what I experienced in my first couple of years in Greek life. And so I did have a chance to meet other gay identifying members of my fraternity, but I think it was so not talked about and it was kind of looked down upon by older brothers in the fraternity, and it still is. Like we still are not in a place where sexuality is accepted by all members. And so that alone just really kind of made me think twice about coming out in college. And so that experience, even though I love my fraternity to death, really kind of shielded me from being my authentic self in college. And even as a Sigma man to this day, I don't share that part of me in that fraternity space. So that's, I think, something to highlight in the fraternity sorority world as well. So the next to last identity I want to share is my socioeconomic status. And so this has been something I've always thought about, especially as a teenager when, and even until now. But I think I really realized that it was a thing when I went to middle school and high school. And so my family, like I said, my mom and dad did not complete college or whatnot, and my mom remarried after she got out of rehab, and then she divorced later on. But my stepdad was a Marine, and we were in a situation where we were like upper class for maybe a good 5 to 6 years of my life. We were in California, and then we moved back to Georgia, and lived in some very, very nice houses. And so I remember then just feeling like life was okay. But I remember when the divorce happened, we moved back with my grandmother, which was in the middle of Decatur. So smaller house, and we kind of stayed there for the rest of my middle school and high school career. So finances were really huge, like as a kid. I remember just knowing I couldn't buy the newest shoes or the newest things that kids were wearing like at school. So I always felt a little inferior going back to school, like especially like when you start in August and everyone has new clothes, new book bags, new just little things like that. And I never had that, and so that's something that really kind of increased my motivation to want to pursue education and go to college because I wanted to make great money and do great things, right? And so I just remember that being like a motivating factor for me to get an education. And so in adolescence, again, that just pushed me to be great. And so I think about it now just because now that I went through college, I tried to be pre-med like everyone else, wanted to be a doctor, and then that changed to like maybe a lawyer, kind of doing those careers that would make me some type of money and not really like what I really truly wanted to do. And so finally got to my senior year and said I'm sociology and I'm going to go to grad school for something. And so student affairs became that thing, and I've been in student affairs full time, again, like I said, for like almost 6-7 years. And for me, I still think about it now because even as an alumni with 2 degrees, I still think about finances because, again, like we all know, student affairs is not the most highly paid salary type of role, but it fulfills me every day. But I do have to think about my finances when with other friends who are alumni as well, who have college degrees, who maybe work in different industries, such as finance, accounting. I have a lot of friends who work in business, consulting, different things like that. And it just seems that sometimes when we want to plan a trip together or just do some activity together, that they are able to just kind of say, "Hey, I'm down." I'm on the other hand have to kind of say, "Oh, let me think about this." So I think that's always, the sense of belonging piece there is definitely related to more so what I read about in our chapter with Patton as well with the socioeconomic or social class status, is that it's something that constantly is like reverting in my mind because it would stem from childhood to now adulthood. And so this is an ongoing the social class thing that I think about as an adult. And I think for me is just getting to the point where I'm okay with where I am and I'm fulfilled and happy in my particular role. And so I've been garnering that recently, but I think that's something that always shows up in my personal life that is really salient to like my friendships with other people. And so lastly, I thought this one was different because it's not really a actual theory that goes along with this, but I think for me that what I've realized in the past 2 years is that my age is now a factor. I always was afraid to get older. I remember being 15 saying I thought 30 was so old. And now that I'm almost 32 next month, age has been a really huge factor. I currently serve as a complex director in residence life at Emory, and so I'm still supervising 18, 19-year-olds. So Generation Z is like who I supervise. And so I've realized that I've been supervising students since I was about 24, 25, and maybe even younger than that. Since in grad school, I was 23. And so knowing that my age is increasing, but my students are staying the same age has been a thing that I've really recognized in the past couple of years, just because I'm just seeing how the relatability and kind of my passion area is going more towards new professionals in student affairs instead of like actual undergraduate or graduate students. So that's been something really salient that I recognize that I'm getting older, and I'm not old. I'm not old at all, but for me, it's like, wow, 8 more years to 40. That's a reality that I have to kind of like just figure out, because I think sometimes I compare myself to my peers in student affairs, and so at 32 you're not an assistant director or an associate director or even maybe sometimes a director, you're considered behind. And so I think that has been something that I've always looked at and like asking myself, am I behind in life? Don't have kids, don't have a partner. What does that look like for me at 32 and going to like middle 30s soon? So that's been something really that I've really been trying to kind of conceptualized for the past 2 years. So with age has come also things I've thought about too in terms of my career path. And so Kohlberg's theory of moral development sticks out to me, I think, the most with this, because I think for me in this part of my career that I'm realizing that I want to leave residence life and go more student conduct. And so student conduct really utilizes Kohlberg's theory in a lot of different places that I've worked at. And so, getting students to think morally about how their behavior or how their actions really affect not just themselves or like maybe a family member or a friend, but how it affects the bigger community and like how that kind of represents themselves in the community. And so I think as I've progressed in my age that I really want to channel in more into like, how do I be moral? How am I moral as a person? how do my decisions that I make affect not just myself, but the greater purpose or community or department or even division. And so I was always thinking about that in my back of my mind. So looking at Kohlberg's theory of moral development in our pattern reading really had me thinking about how I want to encourage students to do that as well in my work that I do daily. And so you can do that in many different functional areas, but I think conduct has a way of like, really setting norms of like what campus life looks like, community expectations, decision making, and how we can be one as a community. So that's where I really kind of hone in on terms of like me growing in age, but also me relating to my actual function area that I want to work in full time. So lastly, the beauty of identity development is really the intersections that we hold as people. I was talking to one of my RAs yesterday, and I asked her, like, how many residents do you have? And she told me 65. And I said, you have 65 stories of identity, of intersections that apply to each individual, and you have an opportunity to get to know them and their story. And so we all have a story, whether it be about our race, our class, where we come from, in terms of like environment and like location, our sexuality, even our abilities. And so we have an opportunity to really share stories in this particular field. So I love the fact that we have so many intersecting roles. I remember doing a program last year at ACPA called Black and. So it was really targeted to our Black professionals and like how we talk about intersection, about being Black and what else. Because I think sometimes we get into the mindset that we're Black only, and that's not the case at all. We are Black, and we are able to contribute our identities to different spaces within the division or even ACP, like I was giving an example for. And so I, for one, I'm an advocate for like just knowing those stories, knowing those people, and like really in my development, how do I show up with these intersections, because it can show up differently at work, my personal life, with family, with friends, even when I go to church. So these things I'm always thinking about how I show up in these spaces with my intersections. And so that's the beauty of who we are as people, and I hope to continue to develop these intersections in my identity, where I can continue to feedback and give back to the field through that way. So again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I hope everyone has a great day.